Everybody, so we are moving on to chapter 18. I just now realized I don't have chapter 18 there, but the first chapter, or the second chapter of the cardiovascular system, blood is also part of the cardiovascular system, which today we're going to focus on the heart. So the plan for today is we're going to look over pulmonary and systemic circuits. We'll jump into heart anatomy, and I'll break down heart anatomy into kind of two videos. So we'll kind of make circuits as well as kind of heart valves down to video 1. And then we'll talk about blood flow and coronary circulation in our second. We'll talk about microscopic anatomy as well as mechanisms, the events of contraction of those cardiac muscles in R3. And then we'll talk about kind of electrical events will be in 4. Yeah, I'm breaking this down quite extensively today. This will be our 5th, and this will be our 6th. And I wanted to break it down into smaller chunks just because a lot of these are kind of complex physiological processes. So this is our first really heavy physiology lecture. So the objectives list is located here. You guys know the spiel. Make sure you guys are looking over your objectives as you guys are studying and looking at and learning your material for each chapter. So when we talk about the heart, we can actually have kind of two systems or two circuits that are involved in this process. We have our pulmonary circuit and we have our systemic circuit. Okay, and that is because the right side of the heart and the left side of the heart are pumping to two different systems. So we have these side-by-side pumps. The right side receives oxygen-poor blood from the body. Okay, so we can see this here. We're going to receive oxygen-poor blood from the body on the right side. Now, don't forget, when we're looking at the heart, we're looking at the patient's heart. So this is right side, this is left side. Okay, so that right side is going to receive oxygen-poor blood from the body, and it's going to pump that blood out to our lungs. Okay, so this is why the right side is considered the pulmonary circuit, because the pump on the right side is pumping to the respiratory system or to the lungs, where it's going to basically drop off CO2 and pick up oxygen. The left side of the heart receives oxygen-rich blood from the lungs, but it's going to pump that blood out to the body. Okay, so the circuit is really, the name of the circuit is really defined on where that pump is pumping to, not where it's receiving from. So the right side or the left side is going to pump oxygen-rich blood to the body, and this is why it's known as the systemic circuit. Okay. When we look at the heart itself, it's approximately about the size of your fist. So if you kind of make a fist, the size of your heart, okay, is about the size of that fist. The base and the apex are actually a little bit confusing on where they're referring to. So the base is actually up here towards the top. Okay, so the base is where all of these vessels come in and leave. Okay, is known as the base. It has a slight right tilt to the right shoulder, okay, of the patient or the individual, and the apex is actually the point of the heart, which actually points down towards the left hip. Okay, if you think about, a lot of people think about a mountain when they think about an apex and the base, right? We often think of this as the base and this is the apex, right? Okay, and the only reason this is the apex is it comes to a point, right? If we had a valley in the ocean, right, this would still be the apex and this would be the base of that valley at the ocean floor. So all an apex is a point. So if you keep that in mind, right, even though the apex of the heart is down, we want to call it the base, it's the point of the heart. You can examine the apical impulse, okay, which is basically palpitated. Palpitated just means felt, okay, between the 5th and 6th rib, just below the left nipple of an individual. So the heart itself is not free in the thoracic cavity. It's actually anchored by a sac known as the pericardium. And the pericardium has what's known as a superior fibrous pericardium. It's a fibrous layer, and we can kind of see this here. This up here is our fibrous pericardium. And what it does, what that fibrous pericardium does, is it anchors the heart to the surrounding wall and prevents overfilling of that heart. So it's really an anchoring point. You guys in AMP1, if you took it with me, if you had lab with me, you most likely saw the heart in the pericardial sac, and on the outside it looked like it had a whole bunch of fat, right? That is the fibrous pericardium that's going to anchor within the thoracic cavity. And then deep to that, we have two additional layers. We have our parietal pericardium, which is this layer right here, okay? And it actually kind of swoops in around on itself. It's actually a continuous layer. And we have a membrane that overlays the heart, and this is called the visceral pericardium. Now, the visceral pericardium is when we talk about the layers of the heart itself, okay? So there's layers of the pericardium, which are the fibrous pericardium, the parietal pericardium, and the visceral pericardium. And then we also have layers of the heart, which we'll talk about here in a few minutes. That visceral pericardium and the epicardium, which is a layer of the heart, are the exact same structure. Okay, it's the exact same membrane. It's just we call it differently depending on whether we're referring to the pericardium or whether we're referring to the layer of the heart. Now, inside of this region here, okay, we have what's known as the pericardial cavity, and inside that cavity there's a fluid that exists in there called the pericardial fluid, and that's really there to help the heart pump in a friction-free environment, as well as lubricate the heart as well. Now, I want to just mention this a little bit notion of the sac. If you took a balloon, right, a balloon that's full, and I wish I had a balloon, if I would have thought about it, okay, and I put my fist in that balloon, right, that balloon's going to come up and it's going to form a circle, and it's going to basically adhere to my hand and come down and then come back out like this, right? The outside of that balloon, okay, would be our parietal pericardium. The air in the middle would be our pericardial fluid, where our fluid would be, and the part of the balloon that's adhering to my hand would be the same as the visceral pericardium. So that's the pericardial sac. Again, it's an anchoring mechanism. It creates a friction-free environment. Okay, it's a protective structure. And now we have the heart. And the heart actually consists of three different layers. The epicardium, again, which is the same, right, as in right here, but it says it here, same as our visceral layer of our serous pericardium, right? So it's the exact same layer as that visceral pericardium. And if we look over here on the heart, it actually is the shininess. See how this heart over here has a shininess to it? That is that epicardium, okay? Now, if we cut or reflect back a chamber on that, what we can see is the myocardium. So the epicardium is the shiny of heart. I don't know if it has any there. We're just going to make it shiny, okay? So you can kind of see that over here. Okay. The myocardium is the muscle. Okay, it's the cardiac cells forming this kind of muscle appearance. It's the bulk of the heart. It makes up the majority of the heart. Okay, and then we have the endocardium, which is on the inside. Okay, you can kind of see this here. Okay, and it also has a shininess to it. Excuse me. But those cells that make up that endocardium actually continue out of the heart and become the inside of our blood vessels. So it's continuous. Those cell populations are continuous with the blood vessels. And again, the endocardium is going to line the heart chambers as well as our heart valves. If we basically open up the heart and look at the structures of the heart, okay, we have 4 different chambers that exist in our heart. We have 2 atrium, okay, these are our atrium here, okay, so we have a right and a left atrium. And please, you guys, do not use LA and RA and RV and LV as abbreviations. If I ask you something on a quiz, you need to write those out. I'm just doing it for space sake. Okay, like hormones, you can write out as acronyms because clinically they use those terms, like thyroid stimulating hormone, you can write as TSH. Right ventricle, I do not want to see RA because clinically they don't abbreviate right ventricle as an RA term. Okay, I'm just doing it again for the sake of space. Okay, so we have 2 atrium, okay, that are towards the base of the heart, up towards the top. Okay, and then we have two inferior ventricles, right? So we have our right ventricle, and we'll talk about these here in a little while, and our left ventricle. Okay, now separating both the atrium and the ventricle are something known as a septum. Just like our nose has a septum to separate, our heart also has septums that separate. So this down here is called the intraventricular septum because it separates the ventricles. What you can't see up here on top is what's known as the intraatrial septum, okay, because it's behind these great vessels, and these separate the two atrium. Now, there's a unique feature in the right atrium, right here, called the fossa ovalis. So when we are in fetal development, okay, so when we're in our mom's womb and we're developing, the heart can actually bypass the lungs because our majority of the blood, not the heart, the majority of the blood that enters the heart can bypass the lungs because the blood doesn't need to go to the lungs to acquire its oxygen. So instead what happens is some of it gets sent to the lungs just so the lungs can develop, but there's a bypass, and it comes in, basically that bypass is this fossa ovalis, okay? When we're born, that fossa ovalis closes, but there's still kind of a remnant there, which becomes, so in infancy, or during fetal development, it's called the foramen ovale, and then when it's closed, it becomes the fossa ovalis. And so you can actually still see that in a heart, that kind of indentation where that valve used to be. So looking at the two receiving chambers, again, the right side is going to receive from the body, the left side is going to receive from the lungs, okay? The receiving chambers are the atrium, okay? They tend to be small and much thinner walled. The bulk of the heart, when you guys do your heart dissections, not this week, but next week, you're going to see how small those atrial chambers actually are. It's quite astonishing how small the atria is compared to the ventricle. And that comes down to the function of these two variations in these two chambers. Okay, so in terms of our right atrium, there are three veins that empty into our right atrium. A note about veins, okay, these are going to be carrying blood towards heart. Now, I guarantee you, some of you said to yourself, oh, veins, they carry oxygen, poor blood to the heart. Okay, I want you to get that out of your thought, okay, because for 98% of the time that is a true statement, 2% of the time it is not, and in a minute I'll tell you what that 2% situation is, okay? So, we have three veins that empty into the right atrium. We have our inferior vena cava. I was going to say inferior superior vena cava. We have our superior vena cava, okay, or vena cava. And then on the posterior aspect of this heart, there's something called the coronary sinus, okay? When we get to the coronary circulation, I'll show you what, I'll remind you then that empties. And again, it's on the posterior side. I wish I had put one here. But just know that that is a third structure that empties into the right side of the heart, okay? So again, it's going to receive blood from the systemic circuit, okay? And it is going to take that blood and then we'll pump it down, or basically move it down into the right ventricle. Our left atrium, okay, is going to receive blood from 4 pulmonary veins that are coming from the lungs. So again, this right here is the right pulmonary veins, and it's bringing blood in this way, and this goes behind this heart and actually empties into the left atrium over here. Here is the blood coming from the left side of our lungs coming in here. Okay, now what you're going to notice is, see how this color difference, so blue typically represents oxygen poor blood, okay, red typically represents oxygen rich blood, okay. what you're going to see here, right, is this is oxygen poor and it's a vein, and this is oxygen rich. So the vena cava is oxygen poor and it's a vein. And the pulmonary veins are oxygen rich. This is one of those exceptions, right? So this is why I don't want you to remember veins as being oxygen poor as a default, because there are veins, the umbilical vein as well as the pulmonary veins, which actually transport oxygen rich blood. So what I want you to default to is to think of a vein as pumping blood or carrying blood towards the heart, because in both of these situations we're carrying or transporting blood to the heart. Okay. A few features of our atria, okay, or our atrium, are the addition or the presence of these structures known as auricles. Auricles are kind of these little ear-like structures that exist on our right and our left atrium, and you can kind of see those here, these kind of little ear-like structures. They're appendages, and what they do is they're kind of a volume reserve for the atrium when we need to increase the volume that the volume of blood that's being pumped through the heart. In addition to that, we have a set of muscles known as our pectinate muscles. And see this little these little comb-like structures, okay? Those are your pectinate muscles. And those exist throughout the right side of the heart, but only exist really in the auricles on the left side of the heart. So on the right side, you'll see the pectinate muscles in the right atrium itself, as well as the auricles. On the left side, you'll really only see those pectinate muscles in the auricles themselves. You won't actually see it in the chamber. These muscles, pectinate muscles, are not involved in contraction of the heart. They're thought to be and to serve as a volume reserve also, just like the auricle itself. So the blood that enters into our atrium will then move into the ventricles, and the ventricles are considered our discharging chambers. These are the true pumps of the heart. They tend to have very thick walls, okay? And again, that's because they're going to have to pump either to the lungs or they're going to have to pump to the body, okay? So the right ventricle, which is again located here, okay, is going to receive blood from the right atrium, and it's going to pump blood via the pulmonary trunk, which is this region right here. This is our pulmonary trunk. And the pulmonary trunk will then send blood either to the left lung or the right lung via, okay, the pulmonary veins. Pulmonary arteries. Just kidding. Not veins, arteries. Because now these are moving blood away from the heart, so arteries equal away from heart. Okay, and again, we can see that this is an oxygen poor blood because it's blue. However, it's moving blood away, so it's considered an artery. Okay, so that blood that's coming from the left ventricle is going to the lungs via the pulmonary trunk, via pulmonary arteries. And again, we'll talk more about these anatomical structures here in a little while, okay? Our left ventricle, okay, is going to pump blood basically into the aorta, which is this big, huge structure here, and into our systemic circuit. Now, you'll see the aorta broken down into different subcategories. So typically they'll call this region to this region here called the ascending order because it's going up. This region here is often referred to as the aortic arch because it has an arch. And then what goes down and it goes behind the heart is known as the descending aorta. In looking at the heart chambers, the left and right ventricle, by reflecting back and looking at the chambers themselves, okay? Again, the ventricles make up most of the volume of the heart. Inside of our ventricles, we have structures known as trabecula carneae, and these are irregular ridges on the heart muscle itself. So you can see some trabecula carneae here, some trabecula carneae here, over here in this image. Okay. In addition to that, we have these structures known as papillary muscles. So these papillary muscles here actually protrude up and off of the heart wall, so they actually project out into the chamber of the ventricles, okay? And what they do is they anchor these white structures here known as our chordae tendineae. Now the chordae tendineae anchor, okay, they're attached to these papillary muscles, and they anchor or they hold these valves that we find on the right side and the left side of our heart in place. So when we look at our heart valves, the purpose of a valve, just like in plumbing, you have valves that ensure one-way direction. The heart valves the valves in our heart also ensure this unidirectional blood flow through the heart. So it prevents, for example, blood from going from the left ventricle back up to the left atrium, or from the right ventricle to the right atrium, so on and so forth. They will open and close to different pressure changes. Okay, so we actually have 4 valves that exist within our heart. We have 2 atrioventricular valves, okay? It tells you in its name where they're going to be located. They're going to be located between the atrium and the ventricle. They're often referred to as AV valves. Now, so here is an AV valve, and here is an AV valve. However, I want you to know what the names of those AV valves are. So on the right side, okay, this is called the tricuspid valve, okay, because it actually has 3 cusps to it. The left side is called the mitral valve, okay, because it has, or the bicuspid valve, I'll accept either one of those, is bicuspid because it has 2 cusps to it, okay. And when this heart contracts, okay, it prevents backflow into the atrium when the ventricles are contracting. Okay. So you have these cusps, the ventricle starts to contract, it's going to create pressure, and these valves are going to close. Okay. Now, the chordae tendineae, and the purpose of the chordae tendineae is to help hold those valves closed when the heart's in a contracted state. Now this is a little bit confusing to think about, and let me kind of show you how this kind of works on this slide. Okay, so you have your atrium, and again, your atrium are your filling chambers. They're basically going to move blood down into our ventricles on both sides at the same time. Okay. And then what's going to happen is that ventricle is going to start to contract. And what you can see down here is as that ventricle pushes in and the muscle contracts, right, you're going to build up a pressure in this chamber. Okay. So as this muscle is contracting, I'm just going to designate that by arrows. Okay. The pressure of the blood is basically going to get on the is going to basically hit the underside of this valve and close it. Okay. So what you can see is there's no regurgitation of blood up into the atrium. That does not occur. So it's the force of the blood in the ventricles as the heart's contracting that causes these valves to close. Now, okay, so our valves are open, right? Blood's going down, our ventricle's down here, right? As the heart contracts, these valves close, preventing that regurgitation up into the right atrium or the left atrium. Now, because the contraction is such a powerful event, okay, if these chordae tendineae right here, if these chordae tendineae were not there, the pressure of that fluid would cause those valves to go like this, and then blood would be able to regurgitate. So what happens is, as that heart contracts, okay, the papillary muscle also contracts, this papillary muscle here, holding these valves in place and preventing them from going whoop like this up into the right atrium. So those valves are actually, or the chordae tendineae are actually anchors to kind of hold those valves as they're basically being pushed on by the blood. Kind of weird to think about, but really cool at the same time. Okay? So those are our atrioventricular valves. Okay? Prevents regurgitation or backflow into, when I say regurgitation, what I mean is backflow, okay, into the right atrium. When the ventricles are contracting, The bicuspid and the tricuspid valves help prevent that backflow, okay, and are held shut by the chordae tendineae and the papillary muscle as that papillary muscle contracts. We have two other valves that are also going to prevent backflow. Those are called semilunar valves. And these semilunar valves are called semilunar valves, okay, because they have kind of a semilunar appearance to them. Okay, so we have our pulmonary semilunar valves, well designated with 1, which is right here, or right here. Okay, and we have our aortic semilunar valves, which are located over here. Okay, now these valves function differently. They're still going to open and close in response to pressure differences. However, in this case, these are going to close. Okay, these two valves are going to close when the ventricle is relaxed. Okay, so let's look at that. So as our ventricle is contracted, right, we know our semilunar, or our atrioventricular valves right here are closed. We know that blood's going to eject up out of our semilunar valves, okay, because it has to escape somewhere. And then what's going to happen is the following. The ventricles are going to relax after they've ejected their blood. And what's going to happen is as that blood goes up, okay, the ventricles are going to relax, and this blood's going to want to come back down into an area of lower pressure. However, it can't, because as it shoots up, right, the ventricles relax. As it wants to come back down, it's basically going to catch those and close those valves. Okay, so envision having a tube. No. Okay, so envision having we're going to pretend like this is a tube. Okay, now what if I had a valve in here? Okay, a valve just like that atrioventricular or the semilunar valves. Okay, if I squeezed here and pushed that fluid up, and let's say there's no valve in here, right? I squeeze here, I push that fluid up, and I let go of that, right? That fluid's just going to go back down. Now, if I put these little valves on here, oh, I do have a Sharpie. So we're going to draw a little valve really quick. Look like little boobs or a little butt. You guys can't really see that, but you guys get the gist of it. Well, there we go. Okay, I have valves in there now. Okay, what's going to happen is, as I squeeze this, right, fluid's going to go up through those valves, but when I relax that squeeze, those valves I just drew are going to catch it and prevent it from going back down. Okay, so that's how these valves work. They're going to close when the heart is in a relaxed state. Okay, so a few homeostatic imbalances that we see in relation to those valves, okay, one is called an incompetent valve, and this is where blood backflows, so the heart repumps, okay, the same blood over and over. So envision, right, what happens in this case is as that heart contracts, well, it's usually in this state here, when that heart contracts, these valves become flabby, okay, so they actually start to regurgitate up like this, the valve goes like this, okay, and blood is able to go back up here. And then what happens is it just keep toggling back and forth, because that pressure, right, as the heart is contracting here, you want the blood to go this way, but what's happening is these valves are incompetent, so the blood's actually going this way in the wrong direction. Okay. The other homeostatic imbalance that we see is something called valvular stenosis. And stenosis is typically associated with hardening. So what happens is these valves start to become hardened. They don't flow really beautifully. And so what happens is as they're open, okay, when they go to close, they're kind of like, ugh, right? They don't close quite as well. Not only do they not close quite as well, as they don't open as freely either. So what happens is this puts a lot of stress on the heart muscle itself, and the heart has to exert a lot more force to get the blood to move through. The great thing about valves is they can be replaced by multiple different sources. So you can actually have a mechanical valve, and it sounds exactly like what it is. It's like a valve you would put in like a machine, which is crazy, right? So they can put mechanical valves in. They can actually use animal valves. So I've had a student in the past who has had a pig valve. Okay, they can also use cow valves as well, bovine valves. And then also they could use a cadaver valve. They all have their pros and their cons, so it really is dependent on how old the patient is, the reason for the valve replacement. But those, so a valve that is misfunctioning or not functioning properly can be replaced, and that heart goes back to carrying out a normal function.